Welcome everybody to our deep dive election analysis 2020. And we are featuring all of us, but particularly Caleb Fox and Jared Kamrass, they'll explain in a moment what their role is and how they do their analysis. But be sure that everybody can participate, and let's make it really important, not only for looking back over the election that just occurred, but also looking forward. We want to learn what are the lessons we can carry forward into 2021 and the next year as well, 2022. So many important elections coming up in 2022. Caleb, may I start with you and to ask, how do you do your analysis? Where do you go? What would your suggestions be if we've got some up and coming analysts to come? But how do you do yours, and what's your suggestion for us that we might want to do analysis ourselves?
Well, I've always been a number cruncher, basically. And I do my analysis pretty much just using an Excel spreadsheet. I take various elections, I compare one candidate to another by precinct, by area. And then I try and figure out, once I see those numbers, what lies behind them. You know, what were the reasons for those numbers? And you know, so that part is just kind of, you know, seat of the pants judgment sort of thing, but the numbers are always where I start. I just, you know, I crunch numbers.
Yeah, that's cool. How about for you, Jared Kamrass? And most of the people know Caleb, of course, is the former director for the Hamilton County Democratic Party. And thank you for your service on the Board of Election, Hamilton County Board of Elections, Caleb. Your team there at the board did a fabulous job, it seemed to us. And many of us were active in different ways there. Brewster organized, and we got on board with him with a real courtesy to the early voters during that whole period. So we were involved in lots of ways with the Board of Elections. You and your team did a great job. Jared, how about for you? How do you work your system, and what can we learn from you to become analysts ourselves?
Well, first of all, I think Caleb is being a little modest.
Go ahead, Jared. I think it froze. Am I the only one that cannot hear Jared?
No, I can't hear him either.
No, he needs to go out and come back in.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Okay,
great.
So the last word we heard was modest.
Yes, Caleb is being modest. He is the foremost numbers cruncher, elections data analyst that we have in Hamilton County, and so you know, I'm hoping to learn tonight too from him. But for me, I do a lot of both reading, you know, so I see trends in other parts of the country, you know, and try to apply them here locally. I see trends in other part of the state of Ohio, and try to apply those locally. But at the end of the day, what really matters is being able to look at the raw data that's put out by the Board of Elections and the Secretary of State, and doing what Caleb does, which is figuring out how to manipulate it correctly to pull out those trends or even anomalies, and then be able to work backwards and try to figure out what explains them.
Yeah. Wow. Good. Okay. Now let's look in here. It's so good. Jamie Kessel, it's so good. Thank you again for running and for being kind of a frequent member here of Bold New Democracy. It's really an honor to have you involved. Caleb, would you be able to share just off the top of your head or what you've seen in the District 2 race? Are there any patterns change? We know it's terribly gerrymandered, but any data about Jamie's race that surprised you or that you could mention?
Well, I hate to say it, but I think that race, when you just look at numbers, was unfortunately fairly predictable. Um, she worked her tail off.
Yep. Way to go.
That is one in which the Hamilton County portion, which is only a relatively small minority of the whole district, is really the only Democratic part of the whole district. And so, you can win Hamilton County all you want, but unless you can find ways to win in Claremont County and Adams County and all the rest of them, you don't really have much of a chance. And that district is just drawn in such a way that it would take a miracle really for a Democrat at this point to win it. If you go back some years when Gene Schmidt held that district, it was a little bit of a different critter. But since Gene Schmidt was pushed out by Wenstrup, once that happened, it just kind of reverted to form. And the reason that was true was Gene Schmidt antagonized as many Republicans as she did Democrats. And Wenstrup is at least smart enough not to do that. So unfortunately, I think once the districts are redrawn this coming year, that district is going to become even more unfriendly to Democrats. We are likely to wind up with a district that is completely contained in Hamilton County, which will definitely be a Democratic district. And at that point, we're going to have a free-for-all among the Democrats to see who's going to run. But District 2 is going to kind of fall by the wayside, is not really very winnable at all.
Yeah, right. Jared, I know you worked kind of as a strategist and behind the scenes with Kate Schroeder's campaign in District 1. What are some of the kind of top of your head or surprises that have occurred as you analyze that the voting in that District 1, Jared?
Yeah, so District 1 has been remarkably consistent as well over the last several cycles. The addition of Warren County to that district in this decade was drawn to shore up what had previously been a somewhat competitive district, and it has done exactly what it was supposed to do. Now, Warren County is growing quickly. I think it's the second or third fastest growing county in the state. And it is getting bluer, as especially the suburbs around Mason and Kings and Deerfield and Cincinnati suburbs and Springboro and Dayton suburban areas keep growing. But unfortunately, it still is overwhelmingly Republican. And the key for a Democrat there, if you're going to win in the first district, is to hold Warren County to only 30% of the total electorate in that district, and try to get to 35% in terms of vote share. This year, Kate got to 31, Biden got to 33 in Warren County, so not enough. And Warren County turnout was through the roof. It was over 80% in Warren County, whereas it was only in the mid to high 60s in the Hamilton County portion of the district. And so when you have gaps like that in terms of turnout between your Democratic base areas and Republican base areas, it can make a district that could be competitive still out of reach pretty quickly.
Yeah. What do you account for the 80% is just, it seems to me, just shocking nowadays in American politics. What do you account for that high turnout in Warren?
There's a few things, I think. One, the demographics of Warren County lend themselves to more habitual voters, folks that are less transient, higher proportion of college degrees. All those are factors that indicate that you're more likely to vote. The second thing is the surge in Warren County from 2 years ago happened almost exclusively amongst Republicans. And I think there are a couple isolating variables we can do from 2 years ago to explain that. But I think most would agree that the presence of Donald Trump on the ballot is the biggest reason for why you have Republican voters who maybe are less frequent voters showing up in a presidential year.
Yeah. Oh, good. Let's open this up now in a conversational way. You're welcome to address Caleb or Jared individually, or we can do the back and forth. And I'd love to have the two of you at times kind of reveal different things to each other that you might see either in a similar way or different way between the two of you, Caleb and Jared. So who's next with a question or comment?
Can I add just one point about turnout?
Please, Caleb.
Turnout sometimes is not quite reliable a number as you might think it is. If you're just looking at percent turnout, I learned this years ago working on Connie Pillich's campaign, that if you compared, say, Forest Park to Montgomery, turnout was higher, but part of the reason turnout was higher was that Forest Park just had more people on the voter rolls there who weren't there anymore. And so that all by itself depresses turnout. People who aren't there can't vote. And then you add to that we had this litigation in Ohio over what was called the purge process, or we at the Board of Elections refer to as the supplemental process, which meant that for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, if not more, what had been a normal process of removing people from the voter rolls because they weren't there anymore, they stopped voting, hadn't happened. And so over a period of time, there was an accumulation of more and more and more of those type of voters, which by itself depresses turnout percent. Yeah. And then leading up to this election, the litigation resulted in that purge process actually happening. And so suddenly a whole lot of people were removed from the voter rolls, and that itself has an impact on percent turnout. So look at total number of voters sometimes rather than just percentage of turnout.
Yeah, how about that? Do you recall off the top of your head, Caleb, the total amount of voters, or Jared, in Warren? Did the total amount really climb in a significant way?
It did, but also part of that's attributable to population growth as well.
Right.
But I think one way to illustrate the point that Caleb's making is in the city of Cincinnati, which has seen a population growth, not overwhelming growth like Nashville or Charlotte or Austin, but stable and steady growth. We actually saw a net decrease in registrants in the city of Cincinnati versus 4 years ago. And the only explanation for that is what Caleb just described of voters being purged from the rolls.
Yeah.
And then the ones who could be re-registered and could be registered not being able to do so or not being contacted, or organized to re-register.
Most graphic example I can think of what I'm talking about was when you looked at the precincts around the University of Cincinnati campus.
Yeah.
That was where you had the largest number of people who were on the rolls who had just stopped voting, meaning that they went to school there, they registered to vote here, they graduated, they moved out of town, they didn't notify the post office that they were moving to Chicago. They stayed on the rolls here for a long time. They weren't voting here because they were in Chicago, but that's why you saw such high percentages of those numbers right around UC's campus.
Yeah, interesting. Yes, who's next, or who to ask a question? Greg.
Caleb and Jared, thank you for coming tonight. I just have a general question for you. Was there anything when you were looking at the data or as you're going through the data that you just thought that's a big surprise to me, that's never happened before, or just anything unusual that you saw, just in general?
Who's first with the
Caleb, I'll let you start if you'd like.
No, I can't really say that I saw anything that was terribly surprising. If you go back a number of years in Hamilton County, it used to be that the Democratic area of Hamilton County was the city of Cincinnati and maybe Forest Park and Woodlawn and a few places like that. But what's changed Hamilton County in the interim over those years is that now we get much higher percentages of the vote in the north central part of the county, Springfield Township, Blue Ash, places like that, even Sharonville, Springdale, places that we just never really had any kind of a chance are now our Democratic areas. And when you look at a countywide level, the things that kind of jumped out at me were that, first of all, on a countywide level, with a couple of exceptions, the only Republicans who won were people who had very strong ballot names. So both Winklers won, for example. Gehring won. Of course, he's been on the ballot for how many years as treasurer? Dieters won. Those are all well-known ballot names. The only other two that I can think of are Amy Searcy. She doesn't fit that description, but I think she, having worked at the Board of Elections, was smart enough. She knew she had to run a really strong campaign, and she did. And Melba Marsh, who is African-American, has always had strong appeal in the African-American community. I think actually, if you went back in her whole career, you could sort of wonder if she really ever was a Republican. She was just recruited to run as a Republican as an African-American. And so she survived. But when you get beyond that, the Democrats pretty much cleaned the clock. And Hamilton County really was kind of an exception in the state of Ohio, because when you get outside of Hamilton County, the Democrats pretty much got their butt kicked, with the one exception of Jennifer Bruner running for state, Supreme Court. But that was, kind of my thumbnail analysis of what I saw happen in Hamilton County. But I saw that as kind of at the end result of a natural progression, I suppose, is the way I would put that.
Yeah. What surprised you, Jared, when you looked at either with the races that you were really behind, working for, or when you analyzed the county or the state?
Yeah, so the big thing that caught my eye this cycle was actually not a local phenomenon so much, but a national phenomenon, which was how much Democrats had their vote share eroded amongst Latino and Hispanic voters.
Yeah.
For a long time, well, I mean, let's back up. So in 2004, George Bush won the Latino and Hispanic vote against John Kerry. 2008, Barack Obama won pretty convincingly in that group, but held it in 2012, and then Hillary actually improved upon those margins even in 2016. What's different about the results we saw in the Hispanic vote this year was that in previous election cycles, the conventional wisdom was always that Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans would vote more conservatively. Mexican Americans, those from the Caribbean or other South American countries would tend to vote more with Democrats. And what we saw this year was that actually across the board, Latino Americans who were voting ran away from Democrats in numbers we haven't seen in 15 years. Again, not just Cuban Americans within South Florida, although we lost two incumbents in congressional districts in South Florida, in the Florida 26th and 27th district. But even in predominantly Mexican American communities along the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, we saw numbers that if we just maintained our 2016 numbers, we actually would have won the state of Texas. And so to me, that's the biggest trend that is not only surprising, but incredibly problematic as we build our coalition moving forward.
Yeah. Is there any, I know the numbers don't always tell the purposes behind or the motivations behind the voters. If you had to guess, or if you've seen any interviews or exits or any of those kinds of things, Jared, what is your guesses of why that occurred?
I think there's a lot of potentially very specific reasons. I think broadly speaking, Democrats communicate with voters oftentimes based on identity and less based on economic status and situation. And quite frankly, especially in South Florida and the Rio Grande Valley, a lot of Latino voters don't necessarily view themselves as Latino first, but they do view themselves as middle class or working class. And so I attribute our slippage with Latino voters, particularly in South Texas, to not be all that different than the slippage we have in Mahoning Valley in Ohio and the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania. It's about an overall underperformance with working class voters as opposed to something based around their identity.
Hey,
Right.
Jared, just real quick, was the running away from Democrats not voting by Latinos or voting Republican?
Voting Republican. Turnout
Okay, so
was
they
actually
actively
correct.
chose something
Yes.
different.
Yes, there was not an appreciable difference in turnout rates amongst Latino voters as other voters. They just went and voted for the Republican.
Yeah. There's a little feedback in our communications, and I'm not sure where it's coming from. If there's any feedback in your line, maybe it is important to that you can pick up to mute and then remember to unmute when to ask a question. Who's next? Yes, Larry.
I wanted to follow up on a comment Caleb made a few minutes ago about the purging the voting rolls. Because when I hear in the media about purging voters, the implication is usually that there's something nefarious or inappropriate about that. And you talked about these voters being ones that were just no longer there, where the purge would have been appropriate. Do you have a sense of to what extent those voter purges were appropriate and how much they were inappropriate?
In all honesty, I would have to say that probably anywhere from 85 to 95% they were appropriate. And I'll tell you, some years ago, one way I tested that when I was still working with the party is I pulled lists of voters who were on that purge list. They weren't being purged, but they were potentially being purged. And I gave them to some volunteers in Hyde Park and suggested they go out and try and track down those voters and try and make sure they got re-registered or did something to make sure they were active voters. And what happened was they came back and said, well, by and large, we couldn't find any of them. We found a few, and they just said they didn't want to be on the voter rolls because they didn't want to have to do jury duty. So what I concluded from that was that, to a good degree, there was real legitimacy to that process, at least the way it's carried out in Ohio. I would make that stipulation, though, because the process in Ohio is slow. The way it works is you fall into what's called an inactive status if you fail to vote in 2 consecutive federal elections, or the Board of Elections sends you a piece of mail and it's returned as undeliverable. We send mail that's not forwardable from the board. And then, having fallen into that inactive status, you have to then not vote for another 4 years, not sign any petitions, not update your registration, do nothing that contacts the Board of Elections in any way. So we're talking about a 6-year process for somebody to finally get purged. And I'll give, I have my problems with Frank LaRose sometimes, but one thing I'll give him credit for is it used to be at the end of those 6 years, we just purged people. Frank LaRose changed the process so that at the very end of the process, they still got yet one more letter saying, you know, if you don't do something, you're going to get purged. And so if somebody was still at the address where they were registered, that gave them yet one more way to make sure the situation got corrected. So my reason I add a caveat to that is that I know in other states, their process is much faster, and I don't think they go through the same level of caution that takes place in Ohio. So at least in Ohio, I don't think the purge process is that big of a problem.
Yeah, it's interesting because we get ourselves riled up as activists sometimes about that and how it can all go. It's good to have a kind of right at the heart of where it's occurring report from you, Caleb. Brewster, you had something to share.
Yeah, first of all, good to see you guys. And thanks for all you do for the party and the candidates. Quick question. Did you all see any evidence of voter fraud in the campaign, either on the Democratic or Republican side?
I'll let Caleb answer that from the Board of Elections perspective. I'll just say, as an operative, I never see voter fraud. I mean, if someone's organizing it at a grand scale, I'm not a part of those meetings. I'm not aware of them. So I don't know if Caleb has, if there have been any instances at the board level this year. I'm sure that if there was, it was a one-off at most, but I'll let him talk about that.
Well, just imagine if the margin was super narrow in Ohio and we lost by 10,000 votes, would there be a there with our complaints about voter fraud?
No, the only place where in all my years at the Board of Elections that I've ever seen voter fraud be demonstrated was rare instances where somebody was able to vote an absentee ballot by mail and then also go to the Board of Election or the polling place and vote an in-person ballot and figure out how to get both of those counted. The other example was we had a couple of instances, one guy in Loveland, for example, whose wife applied for an absentee ballot. She was sent an absentee ballot, but she died before the ballot was even sent because we got a death certificate that told us that. But he then voted his wife's ballot for her and sent it back. So that's a pretty clear example of somebody voting a ballot they shouldn't have. There was another example that same year of a nun who did the same thing with her roommate. We had an example of a poll worker some years ago who actually had the ability in the polling place to negate the notice that we send to the polling places, telling them that if somebody shows up and they have been sent an absentee ballot, they have to vote a provisional ballot. Well, she negated that. She then herself voted an absentee ballot and it counted. And then she herself voted a vote at the polling place and they both counted, but she got caught, But the numbers of that kind of stuff, they're infinitesimal. They are so small that, they couldn't change the outcome of anything, even a race for dog catcher.
Yes, good. Yeah, good. Who would like to share now a question or comment to Jared or to Kate?
I have a question.
Yes, Susan.
About the counties in District 2, about how active and strong is the Democratic Party there, and are there ways to activate those kind of counties?
Well,
Jamie, let's have Jamie. She was out there with her feet on the ground in those counties. Yes, Jamie.
Each of the counties are different in that aspect, Susan. You'll find Highland County is older and they really fell victim to the pandemic. They couldn't even figure out how to do Zoom. So it kind of, they fell to the sideways and Highland just couldn't get anything together. This time last year, I was going to a lot of holiday parties out east. And when I met with the Brown County folks, they said, hey, when you see David Pepper next, you tell him to get down here. So they're small but mighty, but the small part is what it counts right now. So Brown County also just too small and unorganized. Claremont has the most promise. They have their countywide organization, but then the LAT team, the Loveland Action Team, really just, we're so motivated and energized. And that's where I see the progress going to be there. Now, Scioto, they are getting better at getting organized. They had a headquarters, but Scioto was cut in half by, sorry, my husband's doing renovations downstairs. Sure. District 2 and District 6 was Scioto. Pike County is a hot mess. Like even the Democrats there, some of them, they're, Democrat by name. But Ross County, I see that as where things can change too. They have a Democratic mayor in Chillicothe, Luke Fenney, and he would be a fantastic candidate. We need really candidates from there to run because there's so much weight in that hometown pride and there's more trust in that as well. Anybody from Hamilton County, man, you are just going uphill coming out there. But as Caleb said, District 2 is going to change. And, I live in the city and there's no way I'm going to run again in District 2. Sure. Sadly.
Part of the question for the rural as we look to seeing who the next chair of the ODP is, about how we can strengthen and, build those counties up, because
I see two things happening. You need from within, people that live there, organizing there and building it. But number two, it's the national messaging. We allowed ourselves to get stereotyped by the Republican Party. They say Democrats are communists. They are baby killers. They are all these things. They are going to take your gun and your God. And that's what they hear. It's the national messaging. And that's really, really hard to combat. So I think it's going to take some national organization and really branding to change some things and probably some time. I think working with the suburbs, with the independents there and getting more Democrats there is more likely to happen first before really getting to these rural folks, because Trump was just so embedded. And that's what surprised me with the turnout in Ohio. That was like, an 8-point bump, that Trump bump. So I did pretty much the same as Jill, except that extra 4 points of the Trump turnout. So I did better in every single county numbers wise, but Trump did even better.
Yeah.
So that's he's a folk hero out there, and that's really hard to combat.
Wow. Yeah. Jared, did you have someone, I know you worked with Kate here, and did you have any other clients, as if that's the right word, for the candidates that you work with in rural areas? What's your view of how we can relate with and communicate effectively in the rural counties and towns and areas?
Well, though it wasn't on the ballot this year, Mayor Feeney in Chillicothe is a client of ours, and Jamie's right. I mean, he does a heck of a job, not just in kind of exuding that kind of hometown pride, but part of the things that we're up against in rural areas, I think Jamie hit the nail on the head about the overall Democratic brand nationally is an uphill battle for us. But, Fox News is on every TV. It's in every mechanic shop. It's in every diner. It is completely permeating the culture in a lot of rural counties. And that's a really hard thing to go against when there is literally satellite beaming propaganda directly into the homes and businesses of a lot of voters in these places. And how do we combat that? I'm not sure you do completely. I think the point the point in these rural areas, and what Jamie tried to do and did well, is you cut your margins. And the way you cut your margins is you get these one-on-one relationships built, which is especially hard in a pandemic, especially in places that aren't as tech savvy. But you do it by having a message about what Democrats can do for you, that people will experience some cognitive dissonance about when they hear what Fox News says about Democrats. So I think broadly we still struggle with an economic message. I think we do a decent job on healthcare, but I think as a party nationally, we fundamentally underestimated that most voters view COVID as an economic issue as opposed to a healthcare issue. We thought people would view COVID as a healthcare issue, public health issue, when in fact it wasn't in the eyes of most voters. And we still haven't cracked that code. I think until we can do that and combine that with strong on the ground organizing, it's going to be tough sledding in a lot of these places.
Can I add something to that?
Sure, Caleb.
Here I'm going to draw on my background as an urban planner and a number of years that I worked as an urban planning consultant. And a good deal of my time as an urban planning consultant got spent in West Virginia. And one of the things that became really apparent to me about West Virginia was that younger folks in West Virginia who had some brains and ambition, they got up and left, And, so what you got left behind in West Virginia in many cases were folks who didn't quite have the same stuff. And where I'm going with that is just that I think the economies of rural areas all over this country have been on a slow, steady decline for quite some time. And what we are seeing over a period of time is populations concentrating around urban areas. That's where the prosperity is. I think I saw something the other day where somebody was pointing out that 70% of the national GDP comes from counties that Biden won. And those are very few counties, but they represent a huge part of the population. And the remaining part is those rural counties whose economies are slowly sliding further away. And the Democrats just really haven't figured out how to message them or even address the kind of problems they're facing in those areas. And that's not an easy nut to crack, but I think that's part of the reason Trump had such an appeal in those areas is because those counties have been, finding themselves being left behind.
Yes.
Really.
Yes. Yes. Who would like to share a question or a concern next? Yes, Chuck.
Yeah, I'd like to know how much more money translates into more votes. I mean, I saw these ads that Shabbat was running against Kate Schroeder, which just made her out to be the most radical person, and Tom Brinkman did the same thing with Sarah Bitter. It was just like, I didn't even recognize these people he was describing. So how much does more money mean more of these crazy ads and really help you a lot?
Yeah, you go first, Jared, because I know you were facing that with Kate.
Yeah, money matters a ton. Obviously, the message matters more, and so it's if you have a message that resonates, you can get a lot further with fewer dollars. Now, what the Republicans do effectively is they have a good message, a persuasive message. I think most of us on this call would disagree with it, but it is persuasive and effective, and they have a lot of money, and so what Democrats have to do typically is out-organize and come up with an equally persuasive, if not more so persuasive message. This time around, what we saw is less ticket splitting than ever before. That's been a trend that's been ongoing for years. It used to be quite common where voters would vote for candidates of each party on their own ballot, and obviously that's become a thing of the past. And to the extent we saw ticket splitting this year around the country, it was against us. We saw people voting for Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, but then coming back and voting for a Republican for Congress or state legislature or county commissioner. And that's something that we had to combat. But the reason I bring it up is, these individual races aren't happening in a vacuum. They're happening in the context of a national conversation and national energy. And, obviously voters of all stripes are motivated to vote in this election. If someone who goes out to vote for Donald Trump is exceedingly unlikely to go vote for Kate or Jamie or someone else in that next line because they're just voting for every Republican they can find. Now, we've been the beneficiary of that in Hamilton County in the last couple cycles, where some well-known Republicans, Caleb mentioned some well-known Republicans that have hung on, but there have been a lot of well-known Republicans who lost. Think of Norbert Natal this year, who's been around 40 years and lost, and Charlie Winburn, who's been around forever, not an incumbent, but a well-known candidate, and he lost. And so Democrats in certain places see the advantage of that, but when it comes to spending money, a lot of times what you're really trying to do is juice turnout and just make sure you're not losing the narrative rather than truly persuading people.
Yeah. Caleb, your thoughts? Money.
Well, I agree with Jared. And the only thing I would add to that is if you have one candidate who has the money to get their message out and you have another candidate that does not have the money to get their message out, then money really does matter, especially much. If you've got two candidates who have money to get their message out, then now we're competing on message, not money. So there's a point where money helps, but it's not decisive. There are plenty of examples around, all over the place of candidates who had a whole lot of money but still lost. So money is not the end all and be all, but it does mean you can get your message out, and that's important.
Mm-hmm.
Fernand Rucker is in this example of somebody who partly lost because his opponent had both the money to get a message out and then a really nasty message that resonated with people and undercut Fernand. And Fernand really didn't have the ability to respond. And that played a role.
Yeah, right.
I have a question in that line about social media is putting up that things are questionable or not allowing things to be put up, like Trump put up stuff and it was taken off. Why can't we do that for TV and radio? I mean, it just seems to me the lies that are told, it should not be allowed.
Sounds like the fairness doctrine.
Yeah, that's right. What year was that, Caleb?
I said that sounds like the fairness doctrine.
I know. What year was the fairness doctrine?
Well, the fairness doctrine, was done away with way back in the Reagan administration. But the caveat I would add to that was it used to be that if you had a federal broadcasting license, radio or TV, you had to be able to prove that you were fair about how you presented things and you presented both sides and you didn't spread stuff that was flatly not true. And if you did, you could have your broadcast license suspended. Reagan got rid of that. But the caveat to that is that the fairness doctrine only applied to broadcast licenses. It never applied to cable, and certainly doesn't apply to the internet. So that's a whole new kettle of fish. How do you, right now you've got Twitter and Facebook and online vendors who are using their own policies, but I don't quite picture in my own mind how we get to the point federal government is going to be regulating that in the way that the fairness doctrine did. A very small percentage of people, well, radio is one thing, but it's certainly a relatively small percentage of people are getting their TV just through broadcast.
Yeah, anything to add to that, Jared?
Yeah, I think there's one major way to fix that problem. In addition to bringing back things like the fairness doctrine, this is somewhat radical, but if the government declared that social media networks were actually a public utility rather than private corporations, they could be regulated the same way that those with FCC licenses are. But Facebook, Twitter, any social media platform, they're private companies where users opt in, and though they function like public utilities, where it feels like everyone has them and needs them to survive, they aren't governed that way because they aren't. And so I think, to Caleb's point, the political speech is treated as the most protected kind of speech. I think for well-intended reasons. It's certainly abused a lot. The Susan B. Anthony v. Driehaus case against Steve Driehaus, in which Susan B. Anthony's List, which is a anti-abortion group, ran ads saying that Steve Driehaus was pro-choice when in fact he was actually pro-life. And the Supreme Court held that you can lie in political speech, and that is firmly within the First Amendment and is not something that can be regulated by the government.
That was a big deal.
Yeah, it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. And so it creates issues both around public utilities, around like federally licensed TV networks, and then also private companies, which, a private company is not subject to the First Amendment. They can do whatever they want, but they're also not regulated like a public utility. And so they're kind of stuck in the middle on how to best regulate their own platform.
Yeah. The city vote, we heard, if it's accurate, that the city vote was only at 50%, city of Cincinnati. You would describe some of that issue before. Is that accurate, the number? And if so, why was the city so low? We worked really hard, even with the limitations of the virus. Caleb, do you have something to share about that?
Well, I'm going to check what you're saying.
Good.
As we speak. That seems a little not accurate to me. Give me just a moment and I'll.
Sure. And if you want to throw up anything onto screen share, we can do that too. You had mentioned that.
No, the turnout in the city was 63%.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
But again, going back to that analogy I did about Forest Park and Montgomery, you have a lot more transitory people in the city.
Yeah.
You have a lot more registered voters who are still on the rolls who just aren't there. So, or they move somewhere else. Maybe they move from the city of Cincinnati out to, Sharonville or other county or wherever. The city is just a place where people move around a lot.
Yeah. Anything to add there about the city itself, Jared? I know you were focusing here on the district.
No, but I think everything Caleb just said is right. And that's not a phenomenon that's in Cincinnati. I think that's true in urban areas across the board. And usually the further away you get from the city center, the higher turnout rates you get. They're starting to invert a little bit, but that's generally the rule.
Yeah, Steve.
I had a couple of quick things here, but you had mentioned Fanon Rucker, and I don't know if you saw the debate, but I knew that there was going to be a debate with Dieters and Fanon Rucker, and about an hour or two before it, the only place I had seen anything on it was on Fanon Rucker's site. Now, I tried getting on the internet and doing a search to even find out when and where it was going to be. And there was nothing. So I didn't find anything. There was no publicity. So I don't think anybody saw it. I had talked to a couple of other people and they all said, oh, there was a debate, nobody knew about it. So that really makes it hard to get the information out, I think. I think Fanon Rucker was very impressive in that debate. I don't know. Did any of you guys see that?
Mm-hmm.
I saw it and I thought Dieters, there was something wrong with him health-wise. He was demonstrably not functioning at full speed.
Yeah. How about taking on an incumbent like Dieter's, well-known, well-financed? How do you address that, Jared? Is it even possible in the?
Yeah. It's definitely possible. So, Fanon was a client of ours, and we had a front row to that race, and it's hard. I mean, for all the reasons that we've discussed around Dieters being a well-known incumbent, having been elected many times in Hamilton County, he's been elected statewide. But I actually think the bigger issue around that race was the position itself. What we've seen in jurisdictions across the country is that long after an area turns blue, it'll still elect Republican prosecutor, district attorney, state's attorney type positions. A lot of reasons for it. What it fundamentally comes down to is that there is this long pervasive, psychology that Republicans are better on law and order, and that they're better on safety. Franklin County, which I believe Joe Biden, well, let's actually go back to Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton won Franklin County, where Columbus is, by over 100,000 votes. And 4 years ago, they still elected a Republican, an incumbent Republican prosecutor.
Yeah.
Now this year, finally, obviously Biden increased his margin on Hillary's margin, but they finally knocked off their Republican prosecutor with, candidly, a far less impressive candidate than they had 4 years ago. And so you're not just going up against that individual's name and track record with voters, you're going up against voter psychology for a position like prosecutor.
Yeah.
They don't really see in something like recorder or even a legislative position.
Yeah. Interesting.
I have a question about Winstrom and your thoughts or opinion about the impact of him joining all of those other Republicans with the Texas case. And is it important, and can we make people remember in 2 years?
Caleb. And now you'll have to unmute, Caleb, because when you were gone, I muted you. You'll have to, okay, 1 second.
I found that pretty obnoxious, but realistically speaking, just because of the nature of that district, and moreover, the way that district is likely to be drawn 2 years from now, I think there is a reason why Wenstrup did that and Shabbat did not. Frankly, I think Wenstrup crossed a line that I find offensive, but I don't think it's going to hurt him. I hate to say it, but that's just, I think, reality.
Yeah, I agree. I think he probably picked up votes by doing that, honestly.
Wow. Yeah. Who has another question or comment? Claire.
I have a question about voting down the ballot. We've spent a lot of time and effort in this campaign trying to encourage voters to not only vote for Biden, but vote all the way down the ticket for all the judges. And I wonder if we have, and clearly that we had some success because we saw how many judges won. But do we have any statistics about, for example, 2016 versus 2020, the percentage of Democrats specifically who just voted on the top line, and then those that voted down the ballot? Did we do how much did we move the needle with the work that we did?
I'll comment on that. I guess I could find those numbers, but that's not something I've spent time looking at. However, I would say this much. I think both this year and 2018 demonstrated the importance of getting the sample ballot out. And over the years, the Republicans used to have a much bigger advantage, a big advantage in getting sample ballots into their own voters' hands over the Democrats. And I think what's happened in the last few years is Democrats have caught up and maybe gained an edge. And that really has helped in getting people to vote down the ballot. I can't really say for certain how you would compare 2016 to 2020. 2016 was disappointing in a lot of ways, but nonetheless, Hillary Clinton carried Hamilton County by around 53%. Interestingly enough, Hillary carried about the county right around 53. Obama carried it right around 53 in both of his elections. Biden carried it by over 57. So
Yeah.
that's a big jump.
Yeah. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that Hamilton County is now a Democratic county.
Yeah.
I think the question around ballot drop off is a good one, but I think the larger question is not, does someone go from voting just for the top of the ticket to then voting their entire ballot? I think there are very few voters that do that. I think what we've seen in previous years is voters voting in the partisan races, and then to your point, Claire, skipping the judicial races because they don't have partisan labels on the ballot. They might recognize some names, but maybe their hand is cramping from filling in the boxes, and they just say, forget it, I'm done. And that does traditionally hurt Democrats far more than it does Republicans. But I think to Caleb's point, getting out the sample ballot, having more robust judicial campaigns than we've had in previous years, and having a more cohesive Democratic ticket, working together in coordination, and making sure that they're making the best of each campaign's capabilities. I think that has made the biggest difference in reducing that cliff that we usually see in drop off from the partisan races to the nonpartisan races.
Yeah. Brewster.
So thank you. Just a quick follow-up on that. So what advice, based on the experience with this election cycle, do each of you all have for the party for the city council slate this coming cycle, as well as for individual candidates?
Yes, we have two candidates, Mika Owens and Derek Bauman, probably others, three, Jamie, probably half the number here that are on the call are city council candidates, actually. But teasing. But yeah, what affects Kenya? That's a good question, Derek. What carryover, or Brewster, what carryover can we have to the city council race and the mayor race?
That one's a tough one, and I'll tell you why I think it's a tough one. I spent a lot of time analyzing city council races over the years. And you can go back years and years, and typically the way things worked is that the incumbents typically won. Maybe you might have one or two open seats. You might rarely have an example of somebody who held a seat who lost. More often you would have an example of somebody who was appointed to a seat who couldn't hold it. But generally speaking, incumbents have won in Cincinnati City Council races over the years. This year is unlike anything we've seen ever before. And the reason I say that is that we were headed into a year where 6 out of the 9 seats were held by people who couldn't run again. Half of them are now running for mayor. So this city council race is going to be a free-for-all in a way that's unlike anything we've ever seen in recorded history, I might say. There just is nothing like it in history that you can go back and look at to say, this is what's likely to happen in a circumstance like this.
No patterns that you could draw from past elections of neighborhoods the candidates are coming from, or positions the candidates might,
Well,
policies they might take.
Cincinnati City Council race is a name recognition race. It always has been. You know, you're picking 9 candidates, and the names who are best known tend to, or who've gained the most attention, shall we say, are the ones who are likely to win. You know, so the previous to this, the one year that I could point to that was kind of out of the pattern was, I'm trying to think, I think it was 2011, when was it 2011 or 13, when Senate Bill 5 was on the ballot. And you had 4 Republican incumbents who lost. 2 of them had been appointed to fill seats, and the other 2 had been there. Leslie Giz, for example, had been there for quite a while, and yet they lost. That was unheard of. But that was because of, I think, because of Senate Bill 5 and the way that drove voters to the polls. That happens to be when PG Sittenfeld, for example, got elected. And we're just in uncharted territory this year with Cincinnati City Council. We're looking at something that we've never seen before.
Yeah. Jared, do you have clients that are running locally in this 2021?
Yeah, I do, and I'll just add to what Caleb's points were, which I think we're all spot on. The other wrinkle with this, with the city council elections, you know, it's not quite the same in terms of building a ticket as we do in federal years. In federal years, we have candidates who are running in separate lines, you know, down the ballot, and they each have a Republican opponent. This time around, even if we endorse 9, you know, and only 9 candidates, they're running against each other, and some are going to win and some are going to lose, and you always need to be looking for whatever small advantage you can find, and that doesn't create a very conducive atmosphere for the same level of coordination and cooperation that we've seen even numbered years. It's not to say that people are going out of their way to hurt other candidates or don't want to support other Democrats. I don't mean that at all. It's just you're running against the field, and you need to just be, you know, you just can't be any slower than the 10th slowest person or 10th fastest person in the race. And makes it really hard to run a coordinated cooperative campaign in that kind of atmosphere. So blame this very stupid and archaic system that we elect 9 city council members in a city our size for why that's hard. But I think you'll probably see more of it this year. We're going to have 1 elected incumbent and Greg Landsman. It looks like with Jan Michelle Kearney, we'll have a 2nd incumbent running, and then seven spots for newcomers. And, you know, I think we're fortunate enough that we have a really strong slate of who those candidates could be and will be. So I think that lends itself a little bit more than a normal year to some coordination, but just generally the nature of the way these races are set up makes it really hard.
I completely agree with what you just said. You know, frankly, I think of the members of council right now, Landsman's probably in a pretty good position. It's pretty unlikely he's going to lose, and probably the same is true with Jan Michelle Kearney. But once you get beyond that, think about it. Who else is somebody who's been on council for a while who has any kind of a name recognition? It's beyond those 2. It's just a wide open free-for-all.
Yeah. Thank you. Who has the next question or comment about election analysis? Yes, Pat. And you'll have to unmute that. Thanks.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for hosting this.
You're welcome.
I did have a question in the chat because of you're talking about the city council race. In regard to the Latino community in Cincinnati, you know, what's the percentage of increase or, you know, change that we've seen? I guess we could limit it to the city, maybe in the last election or last couple cycles. I feel like that's a really, you know, living in Price Hill, of course, I feel like it's a really untapped community, and how are some ways we might reach out to them?
Who's first? Jared.
Sure. Well, first, Pat, I'm jealous of your kitchen. It looks stunning. So you have a great Zoom background, but certainly would expect nothing less from you. Second, it's really hard to answer that just simply because the best way for us to get demographic information is through exit polling, and we don't have reliable exit polling that granular to get down to the city level. Now we can make some estimates based on census data and voter turnout in certain census tracts. I have not done a deep enough dive yet into that to know for sure. Although it has always been a fascination of mine to study Hispanic turnout in Hamilton County in the city of Cincinnati. Not just in Price Hill, but in places like Carthage and Hartwell, and you know, some of the north central suburban areas, because I think there is untapped potential there. Without having really good data and knowing who is eligible voter, it's really hard for us to do any sort of significant analysis there. I think our community in Cincinnati, it's small, but it's mighty and it's growing. But I just don't think we have done enough in the political process to engage the community into participating. And so I think that's something that we should do more of, certainly.
Yeah, one of the growing edges. What are your thoughts, Caleb?
Well, just to add to what Jared said, we're at a point where census data right now is about as unreliable as it will get, simply because we're 10 years out from the last census. Unfortunately, I'm not entirely confident that what we're going to get out of this current census is all that great, but so it is hard to do the kind of analysis that he's talking about. I still think that community is small in Hamilton County, in the city of Cincinnati, but it's growing. Not just in the city, but there's a concentration out in the Springdale, Sharonville area as well. And there's certainly not a group of voters we want to overlook, but it's something that's hard to get a good handle on.
Yeah. Rob Weidenfeld is a organizer, ward chair, just unstoppable out there in Montgomery. It's so good to see you, Rob, and congratulations for your work there. I'd be interested, Caleb and Jared, in what changes have you seen in the voter? Can you give us some analysis of the Montgomery and maybe the surrounding communities too out there? What's the trends there?
Well, I'll say one of the first things that I think about when I think about Montgomery, and I grew up in Blue Ash, and so I know the area well. It's ground zero for what the shift in demographics that we see nationally among college educated, usually upper middle class voters, abandoning maybe not the Republican Party yet, but certainly that abandoned Donald Trump. Next door in Blue Ash, which is a little bit more racially and ethnically diverse than Montgomery, it's already become a blue city. Hillary, I believe, carried Blue Ash. Biden carried Blue Ash. Montgomery used to be a place where Democrats were afraid to put signs out because they thought that they would be, ostracized by their friends and neighbors. And now not only is it somewhere that's hotly contested, but I think we have an enthusiasm gap to our advantage in Montgomery. And I think the work Rob has done there and so many others is critical to what's happened there. But I also think we benefit from just the way that the national realignments have occurred and specifically in places just like Montgomery.
Yeah, thanks so much to you, Rob. Caleb, what have you seen? You've seen some years go by and changes in Montgomery.
Well, I'll echo what Jared said. Montgomery used to be a place that Democrats didn't have much of a chance. Same with Blue Ash. I'm going to try and do a screen share here.
Oh, good.
See if I can pull it off. But
yeah, let me make sure you're allowed to do it. Yep, you're allowed to do it. And all you have to do is hit your screen share then there, and that should open it up. You have to click on if you have the document opened, it'll open up then.
All right, so this is where I was trying to go.
Well, it's not here yet.
There it is.
Okay, now it's coming.
Okay, so the map on the left is Biden, and the blue areas are where Biden won. And you can see that he won in Blue Ash and Montgomery, and even in pieces of Coleraine Township, big chunk of Sharonville, Springdale. Over here on the other side is Fanon Rucker's race.
Oh, yeah.
And you can see that a lot of the areas where Biden won, Fanon did not.
Yeah.
And while Fanon and the same thing is true down here in Mount Washington, for example. So what I take from that is that we're the reason Hamilton County is now a Democratic county by and large is because we've been able to make inroads in those places. And I agree, Rob has done a great job of moving the message forward and getting people organized in Montgomery. There are people who are doing the same things in Springfield and Springdale and in other places. But that's really kind of the future of the Hamilton County Democratic Party is to build on that trend and to now we need to get competitive candidates in Montgomery City Council races, for example. Used to be we couldn't find any because they all thought it was a hopeless race. Well, maybe not.
Yeah. Would you put that back up, Caleb? I'd like to if you could have any comments, you too, Jared, about the racial element of the Fanon race and those neighborhoods or the precincts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you the areas that were blue on the left and red on the right are overwhelmingly white. I don't think that's going to be a surprise to most folks. Overwhelmingly white, upper middle class, places, and especially if you look, starting not just even in Mount Washington and Anderson, but you look even you go a little bit further west and you see in the Hyde Park, Mount Lookout area, parts of what's Ward 5 in the city that are red, voted for Biden. Norwood, not maybe so much upper middle class and more middle class or working class, but overwhelmingly white. These are areas that we saw a lot of ticket splitting, not just in this race, but maybe in a handful of others. But yeah, the racial component is pretty substantial. I mean, if you look at some of the precincts that Joe Biden won in Sharonville and Montgomery, even Terrace Park, I think that is, these are overwhelmingly white areas.
What's the red area in the middle on Fanon's map to the right? What's that red area towards the top there in the middle of the blue area? That kind of, there's an island of red there that's fairly large in Fanon's map. What's that neighborhood?
That would be Evendale and Reading.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
And parts of Sharonville.
Right. Yes.
Green Hills.
Ann.
Can I
Ann.
say something?
Sure.
I did some of the mail-in ballots at the Board of Elections, and I noticed that there were a number, and I didn't do that many, but I wasn't surprised about Fanon or about the guy that ran against Winkler, because you had a fair number that I got who were Democrats who did not vote for Fanon and didn't vote for, I forget his name, it started with a P. And I began to think that it probably, well, I know Winkler is well known, but that still doesn't matter. I think there had some racism to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Richard?
Yes, Rob.
I would like to just say a brief thing about the subject you were talking about, Montgomery. When we lost in 2018, CD1, AFTAB, and we lost Montgomery by 300 votes, for me, it was almost a moral victory, considering that when I started knocking on doors earlier, there were people whose doors I would knock on who I did not know that said to me, I didn't know there were other Democrats in Montgomery. So I thought coming within 300 votes was great. And what I would tell you is this year, we have 9 precincts. And one of the advantages is that we had all 9 precinct executives covered in all of the precincts. And 8 out of the 9 precincts went for Biden. And the one that didn't was tied. So, but unfortunately, much of our focus was, of course, on Biden, but we were always, when we were out doing lit drops, we were always having all the down ballot races included, but unfortunately, it didn't reflect itself, even though AFTAB did a little bit better. We lost AFTAB clerk of courts this time by 220 votes, so we improved by 80 votes, but Jessica also lost. Even though she's a favorite out here, but she also lost by a similar number. So we still have our work to do. We were very happy to carry. You know, I guess like most of us, we thought that Democrats across the board were so disgusted that once they came out, they were going to vote all the way down ballot. Yeah. But that didn't happen in Montgomery.
Right. Good point. Yes. Caleb, what's the map we're looking at now? And I might have muted you because sometimes there's a feedback that comes from, so if you could unmute Caleb, that would be helpful.
All right, am I there now?
Yep, you're here.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is, let me pull it up and make it a little more, this is a little more confusing because this is a judicial race. And so what you're seeing here is the winner shown in blue and the loser shown in green.
Interesting.
And the race on the left is Ann Flotman, or no, Allison Hathaway's race. And the one on the right is Tom Baradon's race.
Yeah.
And what you can see is that there's a real similarity in the results for Tom Baradon and Fanon Rucker's race. And Tom Baradon had the misfortune of running against Gehring. Hathaway was not running against a well-known Republican candidate. Mm-hmm. And so to the extent that somebody said this is all about race, I don't entirely buy that. These two races suggest to me that the well-known names had a huge advantage. And so we have the reason we've done better in Hamilton County over the years is that we're now doing well out in, these northern parts of Hamilton County.
Yeah.
that's not quite so certain as it is down in the city of Cincinnati.
Right. Comments about this map here? This is fascinating. With Flotman Hathaway on the left and Tom Baradon on the right. Is that right, Caleb?
Yes, that's correct.
And green is the winning color and blue is the loser color.
That's correct.
Okay. Who has comments? Any questions or surprises about this? Thanks for the map. It's helpful.
Caleb, do you by chance have Charmaine's map like this?
I didn't. It'd take me a while to get to it. Charmaine's map would not be the kind of dramatic contrast you're seeing in these two. The reason I pulled up the maps that I did was I was looking for races that showed real contrast and showed trends.
Yeah.
Charmaine, I'm sure, is probably somewhere in the middle between the two of those.
Yeah. That's the shape of the green on the left, the blue on the right are so similar. I mean, when you look at it, I mean, that's surprising. I don't quite understand it. Tell me once more why they look so similar.
Well, I don't know. Can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
You see up here, there's a big green area that's, you go over here and it's,
Yeah.
The Democrat won in areas, say Coleraine Township over here.
Mm-hmm.
Look, this is Springfield Township. Democrat lost there.
Yeah.
Lost there. Democrat lost in most of Blue Ash. Democrat lost in most of Montgomery. Same is true down here in Mount Washington. Democrat did a little, Tom did win some precincts there, but nothing like Allison Hathaway did.
Yeah.
So Tom just had the misfortune of running against Gary.
Yeah.
And there, he ran a hard race. He put his heart and soul.
Yeah, he did.
But he had the misfortune of running against a very well-known name. But over time, Republicans are going to stop. They're going to run out of well-known names.
Right. Oh, good. Thank you. If you don't mind pulling that down, we're getting close to the end. How about some closing question or comment for Jared and Caleb? Who's next? Yes, great.
So when we had Kate, she was mentioning that part of the fall off was probably a little bit because Biden didn't really emphasize Ohio as much as what she would have liked. So with Ohio becoming more of a red state and maybe not as a swing state as it was, what effect do you think the lack of presidential push is going to have on future races in Hamilton County?
I'll answer. I'll speak to that. I was executive director through the 2008, 2012, and 2016 races. And let's just pick 2012, for example. I think we had 30 field staff on the ground.
Yeah.
We had 12 Obama field offices open in Hamilton County. And then you contrast that to this year, we had one Biden staff on the ground and we had no field offices.
Right.
That difference is huge. And so because we were a swing state and we got that kind of national commitment in 2008, 2012, 2016, we're not going to have that going forward. Frankly, I think the Hamilton County Democratic Party did a pretty good job of compensating for that this year. But going forward, it's going to be a while before Ohio falls into the realm of a swing state again.
Yeah, Jared.
I think I agree, and I think we see it most is on mobilization, getting people out to vote rather than persuasion. I think in this day and age, especially in national federal races, people know who they support. Very, very few undecided or persuadable voters. But I think the biggest problem is a direct result of the figures that Caleb just gave, which is you have 30 field staff. They're all dedicated to very specific parts of the county and turning out voters. And without the human power on the ground to go turn out our voters, you know, it makes it more of an uphill battle. You know, and it's to me, you know, it's something that's always been a Democratic competitive advantage, is we're better at organizing and turning out our votes. But if we don't have the investment to help us do it, we give that advantage away. And it is definitely troubling. And I think Caleb's right. Unfortunately, moving forward, it's going to be something we have to overcome for the next little while.
Richard,
Yes,
don't you think this year was kind of an anomaly, though, in this regard? Democrats, I think, love to go knocking on doors, and we really couldn't do it this year. And the Biden campaign wasn't having outside rallies. And when, in fact, Biden made that appearance at Union Terminal, he pretty much told everybody to stay away. And the Republicans were doing just the opposite. So, I mean, Biden was doing the right thing, but in the long term, don't you think that hurt us and that this year will be an anomaly?
I think that might have been an element, but not all that big of a one. You know, who knows what happens going forward, what we're going to look like in 4 years. I don't think Trump's going to be on the ballot in 4 years. I can't imagine the Republican Party would be stupid enough to put him back on the ballot 4 years from now. But who knows? Things have been pretty crazy. But nonetheless, I think Ohio has slipped out of swing state status. So we're not going to get those huge commitments of national staff in the state of Ohio the way we used to get. And that's unfortunate. We're going to have, as a party statewide and county, we're going to have to be prepared for that. And we're going to have to find ways to fill that gap, because you're not going to have 30 full-time staff and 12 offices in the future.
Yeah. Closing question. Your insight into defeating Rob Portman in 22. Jared.
The biggest possible contrast we can find. He is not going to be an easy out. The biggest possible contrast to Rob Portman that we can find, and someone who's not going to be risk averse. I think that's exactly the kind of campaign where you want to take risks and have a message that's different, innovative, think outside the box and where you go and how you communicate. So the short answer is there's no obvious answer, but I think if there ever a time for us to be bold and innovative, it's in that race in particular.
Yeah. Caleb.
I think it's going to depend a whole lot on who the candidate is. Frankly, if I had to pick somebody right now, I'd point at Tim Ryan. You know, he comes from a district he won in a district in the kind of areas where we had trouble. He knows how to speak to that kind of voter. But I agree with Jared. Knocking off Portman is not going to be easy.
Right. Good.
I don't think, you know, putting an AOC up there, for example, would be a guaranteed lose.
Right.
We need somebody who knows how to speak to the voters in the contested areas.
Yeah, the contested areas. Thank you, Jared, so much. Thank you, Caleb, for sharing. It's so important for us to learn, and your dedication to it, your study, your willingness to share with a grassroots organization like Bold New Democracy really makes a difference. So thank you. Thank you all for coming to and for participating, and we can carry this forward to what we can create positive, caring, loving even a change for our society. So thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Richard, are you going to ask about the recording?
Let me turn this off here 1 second. I think I can do this. Do you want to stop cloud recording? Yes.
I